The rifle shot echoed across the valley just as the sun bled into the horizon, and in that single moment, everything Rosalind Crane had built over 3 brutal years hung in the balance. The high desert of New Mexico Territory had no mercy in the summer of 1877, and the Crane homestead had even less. The earth cracked open like old leather, splitting apart in jagged lines that ran through what used to be fertile soil. Rosalind stood at the edge of her father's land, her land now, really, watching dust devils spin themselves into brief existence before collapsing back into nothing. She was 24 years old, and she felt twice that in her bones. Her father, Garrett Crane, had been a dreamer once. He'd come west with visions of abundance, spoke of crops that would reach the sky and cattle that would number in the thousands. But the land had other plans. The drought came first, 3 seasons without proper rain, and then came the debt. Loans from men in Santa Fe who smiled with their mouths but never their eyes. Men who sent others to collect when the payments stopped coming. Rosalind had buried her mother 2 winters past. Consumption had taken her slowly, stealing her breath piece by piece until there was nothing left. Her younger brother Thomas had gone east to find work, promising to send money. That was 8 months ago. The letters stopped after the 3rd one. Now it was just Rosalind and Garrett was no longer the man who'd first broken this stubborn earth. He sat in his chair on the porch most days now, staring at horizons that held nothing but disappointment. His hands, once strong enough to wrestle a plow through rocky soil, now trembled when he tried to hold his coffee cup. Something had broken inside him, not his body, but something deeper, his will, perhaps, his faith, the part of a man that tells him tomorrow might be better than today. So Rosalind carried it all. She woke before dawn to check the irrigation ditches, though there was precious little water to irrigate with. She mended fences that livestock no longer grazed behind, because she'd sold the last of the cattle to pay 3 months' worth of debt. She planted seeds in soil that looked more like ash than earth, watering them with buckets hauled by hand from a creek that grew shallower every day. And she did it all knowing that it probably wouldn't matter. The men would come eventually, the debt collectors, the land speculators, the ones who'd been circling for months like buzzards over something not quite dead yet. They'd come with their papers and their rights, all legal, all proper, and they'd take what little remained, unless she could somehow, impossibly, make the land produce again. It was a Tuesday when she saw the smoke. She'd been in the root cellar, taking inventory of supplies that barely filled 2 shelves. 3 jars of preserved peaches, a sack of flour, half full, dried beans, salt pork that wouldn't last another week. She was calculating how many meals stood between her family and complete hunger when she heard her father's voice. And it wasn't the weak, defeated voice she'd grown accustomed to. It was sharp, urgent. She climbed the ladder quickly, emerging into afternoon heat that hit her like a physical force. Garrett was standing, pointing toward the eastern boundary of their property. A column of dark smoke rose into the pale sky, thick and black and wrong. The Hendersons' place, their nearest neighbors, 3 miles east. Good people. They'd shared what little they had when Rosalind's mother was dying. Sarah Henderson had sat with her for hours, reading scripture in a soft voice, while Rosalind tried to keep the farm from falling apart. Now their home was burning, and Rosalind knew, with a certainty that made her stomach clench, that this was no accident. She ran to the barn and saddled their remaining horse, a mare named Temperance, because her father said that's what you needed most in hard times. The rifle came down from its place above the door, bullets clinking in her pocket as she swung herself up. Garrett was shouting something, but she couldn't hear it over the blood rushing in her ears. She had to know, had to see, had to understand what new horror was descending on their dying corner of the world. The ride took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. The smoke grew thicker as she approached, and she could smell it now. Not just burning wood, but something else. Cloth, leather, the acrid stench of a life being consumed. She came over the ridge expecting to see the Henderson place engulfed, but what she found was somehow worse. The house still stood mostly intact. It was the barn that burned, a deliberate fire, contained and controlled. And in the yard there were men, 6 of them, armed. Not ranch hands or drifters, but professionals. The kind of men who wore violence like a second skin. They had Carl Henderson on his knees, hands behind his head. Sarah and their 2 children huddled near the porch, held there by a man with a shotgun who looked almost bored. Rosalind pulled Temperance to a stop behind a cluster of cottonwood trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the man doing the talking, tall, dressed in a dark suit despite the heat, with a face that might have been handsome if it held any warmth whatsoever. Silas Mortimer. He worked for the Santa Fe Development Company, which was a fancy name for a land-stealing operation that had been devouring failing homesteads across the territory. She couldn't hear the exact words from this distance, but she understood the meaning. Carl had fallen behind on payments. The company was exercising its rights. They'd take the land. And if the Hendersons were smart, they'd leave before something worse than a barn fire happened. It was a message, a demonstration, compliance or consequences. Rosalind's hands tightened on the rifle. 6 men, all armed, all experienced. She was one woman with 4 bullets and a horse that was too old for any kind of quick escape. The mathematics of survival told her to turn around, to ride back home, to warn her father that their time had just gotten even shorter. But Sarah Henderson had held her dying mother's hand. Carl had helped them repair their well when it collapsed 2 summers ago. They were neighbors. They were, in this God-forsaken wilderness, all each other had. She was reaching for the rifle, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself, when she noticed something that made her freeze. There was a 7th figure at the edge of the property, partially hidden by the Hendersons' equipment shed. A man, watching, completely still, and even from this distance she could tell he wasn't part of Mortimer's crew. He was Apache. She knew this from the way he stood, the way he seemed to be part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. His clothing was a mixture of traditional and practical, cotton shirt, leather vest, dark trousers tucked into worn boots. His hair was long, tied back, and he carried himself with a kind of presence that made the armed men in the yard seem like noisy children by comparison. As she watched, frozen in uncertainty, one of Mortimer's men noticed him too. The shout went up, surprise mixed with alarm. Weapons swung toward this new target, but the Apache was already moving, not away, but forward. And what happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come. He moved through those 6 armed men like water flowing around stones. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. A gun was pulled. His hand was already there, redirecting the barrel, the shot going wild. A knife appeared. He was inside the arc of the swing, his elbow connecting with the man's jaw in a sharp crack that Rosalind heard even from her hiding place. 2 men rushed him together, and somehow ended up colliding with each other while he stepped smoothly aside. It wasn't magic, it was skill, training, experience, the kind of fighting knowledge that came from a lifetime of survival. And within 3 minutes, all 6 of Mortimer's men were on the ground, disarmed, groaning or unconscious. Silas Mortimer himself was backed against the Hendersons' porch, his expensive suit dusty, his face pale, his own pistol somehow now in the Apache's hand. The Apache said something, low, in a voice that carried authority despite its quietness. Mortimer nodded frantically. Then he and his men were being herded toward their horses, stumbling, bleeding, their confidence shattered. They mounted up and rode away at a pace just short of a full gallop, leaving the Henderson family standing in shocked silence. Rosalind watched as Carl Henderson approached the Apache, speaking quickly, gesturing. The Apache listened, nodded once, then glanced toward the cottonwoods where Rosalind was hidden. His eyes found hers across the distance, and she realized with a start that he'd known she was there the entire time. He'd known, and he'd acted anyway. Then he was gone, moving back toward the desert, disappearing into the landscape as if he'd never been there at all. Rosalind rode home slowly, her mind spinning. Who was he? Why had he intervened? Apache rarely involved themselves in settler disputes. They had their own troubles, their own battles with the territory's expansion. Yet he'd risked himself to protect people he didn't know, people whose very presence represented the encroachment on lands his people once freely roamed. When she reached the homestead, Garrett was still on the porch. She told him everything, and as she spoke, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not the broken emptiness that had taken up residence there, but something older, something that remembered what it meant to be a man of action. That night, Rosalind lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and knew that everything had changed. Mortimer wouldn't forget what happened. He'd come for the Hendersons again, and when he did, he'd come with more men, better prepared, more ruthless. And if the Hendersons were targets, then the Crane homestead would be next. They came on a Thursday, just after noon, when the heat made everything shimmer like a fever dream, and this time they came for blood. Rosalind was in the garden, if the sad collection of struggling plants could be called that, when she heard the horses. 8 riders this time. Silas Mortimer led them, but he stayed well back, letting others take the forward positions. These weren't the same men from the Henderson place. These were harder, meaner, the kind who'd learned their trade in range wars and mining disputes, places where life was cheap and conscience was a luxury. She straightened slowly, dirt on her hands, and felt the familiar weight of fear settle into her chest. But beneath the fear was something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. Anger. She was tired of being afraid, tired of watching everything crumble, tired of men with guns thinking they could take whatever they wanted simply because they had the power to do so. Garrett emerged from the house, moving slowly, one hand on the doorframe for support. He'd put on his good shirt, the one he'd worn to church back when they still had the energy for such things. It was a gesture of dignity, Rosalind realized, a way of saying that even if they took everything, they couldn't take his right to face them as a man. Mortimer dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust. His face was bruised from his encounter at the Henderson place, a purple shadow along his jaw, a cut above his eye. It should have made him look weaker, but instead, it made him look dangerous. Humiliated men were unpredictable men. The speech was expected. The Cranes were 3 months behind on their loan payments. The Santa Fe Development Company had been more than patient. But patience had limits. They could either pay what they owed, all of it, immediately, or they could sign the transfer papers and leave peacefully. Those were the only options, and they had until sunset to decide. Garrett listened without speaking, his jaw tight. When Mortimer finished, the old man straightened as much as his failing body would allow. "This land belonged to my father before me," he said, and his voice didn't shake. "I worked it for 30 years. My wife is buried on that hill. You want it, you'll have to burn it with me still standing on it." It was the most defiant thing Rosalind had heard her father say in 2 years, and it terrified her, because she could see in Mortimer's eyes that he was willing to do exactly that. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then one of the hired men reached for his gun, and Rosalind knew with absolute certainty that this was how it would end. Violence, blood, the kind of death that newspapers would report in 3 sentences and then forget. Except the Apache was there. Not emerging from hiding, not arriving dramatically on horseback, just there, standing between the Cranes and the armed men, as if he'd materialized from the heat shimmer itself. The same man from the Henderson place, calm, centered, completely unafraid. The hired men reacted instantly, weapons drawn, fingers on triggers. But the Apache, and Rosalind still didn't know his name, simply raised one hand in a gesture that was somehow both peaceful and absolutely commanding. He spoke, not in English but in Spanish first, then Apache, and finally in accented but clear English. "Leave," he said. "This family is under my protection." Mortimer's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "Your protection? You're one man. We're 8, and you're on land that doesn't belong to you. Protecting people who can't pay their debts. Step aside before you get hurt." The Apache tilted his head slightly, considering. Then he spoke again, and this time there was something in his voice that made even the hired guns hesitate. It wasn't a threat exactly, more like a simple statement of fact. "I am Nashoba of the Mescalero people. I was trained by scouts who fought in the Victorio campaign. I have tracked men across desert that would kill you in 3 days. I can read sign that you wouldn't notice if it was painted on your face. If you leave now, you leave with your lives. If you stay—" He paused, letting the implications hang in the air. "Then I will remember each of your faces. And you will never know when I'm watching, when I'm near, when I'm behind you." The silence that followed was profound. Rosalind could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Temperance shifting nervously in the barn, could hear the smallest intake of breath from one of the hired men, a man who, she noticed, had gone pale beneath his sunburn. Mortimer's face worked through several expressions: rage, calculation, frustrated pride. Finally, he spat into the dust. "This isn't over," he said, but he was already backing toward his horse. "The company has rights, legal rights, and no renegade Indian is going to—" "Leave," Nashoba repeated, and something in that single word made it final. They left. Slowly, with backward glances and muttered curses, but they left. Rosalind watched them disappear over the ridge, her legs suddenly weak, her hands trembling with delayed shock. When she turned back, Nashoba was watching her, not her father, but her, as if he understood that she was the one truly keeping this place alive. Garrett stepped forward and Rosalind saw tears in his eyes, not from fear or relief, but from something deeper. Shame, perhaps, or gratitude so profound it hurt. He approached Nashoba with the slow deliberation of a man at church, and then, to Rosalind's shock, he dropped to one knee. "You saved our lives," Garrett said, his voice cracking. "You drove away men who would have killed us or thrown us off our land to die. I am a man of honor, or I was once. And I know what honor demands when a debt can never be repaid with money or labor." Rosalind felt something cold slide down her spine. She knew where this was going, could see it unfolding like a runaway wagon on a steep hill. "My daughter," Garrett continued, gesturing toward Rosalind without looking at her. "She's unmarried, strong, capable. She's worth 10 men in the work she does, and she's all I have left to offer. I'm giving her to you, in marriage, to bind my debt to you, to ensure you have reason to protect us when they come back, because they will come back." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Rosalind couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her father had just, traded her? Offered her like livestock or property to a stranger because he couldn't bear the weight of owing a debt he couldn't pay? She found her voice and it came out sharp and hard. "Father, what are you saying?" But Garrett wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Nashoba with desperate intensity, the look of a drowning man who'd spotted driftwood. "It's the only honorable thing," he said. "The only thing that balances what you've done for us. I won't be a man who takes and gives nothing. I won't be that." Nashoba was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Rosalind, really looked at her, and she saw something in his dark eyes that surprised her. Not desire or satisfaction at being offered a bride, but something that looked almost like regret. "I did not protect your home to gain a wife," he said quietly. "I protected it because what those men were doing was wrong. Because the Henderson family showed me kindness 2 seasons ago when I was tracking bandits through this valley and needed water. Because—" he paused. "Because I understand what it means to watch your homeland be taken by force." "Nevertheless," Garrett insisted, and there was steel in his voice now, the ghost of the man he used to be. "A debt stands, an unpayable debt. And in my people's tradition, in the traditions I was raised with, such a debt must be honored. My daughter's hand in marriage is that honor." Rosalind stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "I am standing right here," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I am not a prize to be given away. I am not property to settle your debts with. I'm a person, Father, and I have my own say in who I marry." Garrett finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was terrible to witness. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Without him, we have nothing, no protection, no hope. When Mortimer comes back, and he will come back, we'll have no defense. But if you're married to Neshoba, if that bond exists, then he's obligated to stand with us. It's not about what I want, Rosalind. It's about survival." "No," Rosalind said flatly. "No, Father, I won't." But Neshoba interrupted, his voice cutting through the rising argument with quiet authority. "I will stay," he said. "I will protect this homestead from the development company and their hired men. But not because of any marriage, not because of any debt. I will stay because—" He glanced at Rosalind, then away. "Because it is what my conscience demands. You need help. I can provide it. That is enough." Garrett shook his head stubbornly. "No, no, that's not— You don't understand. A man must pay his debts. A man must have honor. Without honor, what are we? What am I?" Neshoba's expression softened slightly. "Honor is not always found in old traditions," he said. "Sometimes honor is knowing when to accept help without demanding your pride be satisfied. Your daughter is not yours to give. She belongs to herself." The words, so simple, so direct, seemed to hit Garrett like a physical blow. He swayed slightly, his face crumpling. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. Not like a man defeated, but like a man who'd lost his compass and no longer knew which direction led home. Rosalind stood in the yard with Neshoba, the sun blazing overhead, the dust settling around their feet. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you" seemed insufficient. "I'm sorry," felt wrong. "So," she said the only thing that seemed honest. "He's not a bad man," she said quietly. "He's just broken. The land broke him. The debt broke him. Watching my mother die broke him. He's trying to be what he thinks a man should be. But the world changed, and he didn't change with it." Neshoba nodded slowly. "Many men carry honor like a heavy stone," he said. "They think the weight proves their strength. But sometimes—" He gestured toward the distant mountains. "Sometimes strength is knowing what to put down." He left then, walking away from the homestead toward a cluster of rocks about 200 yards distant. Rosalind watched him go, her emotions a tangled mess she couldn't begin to sort through. Relief that she hadn't been forced into an unwanted marriage, anger at her father for even suggesting it, confusion about this stranger who'd twice risked himself for people he barely knew, and underneath it all, a growing dread about what would happen when Mortimer returned. Because he would return. Men like that always did. That night, Rosalind couldn't sleep. She stood on the porch in her nightdress, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the distant rocks where Neshoba had made camp. She could see the small glow of his fire, tiny and alone in the vast darkness of the territory. He was out there because of them, because he'd chosen to protect strangers, and her father wanted to bind him to them through marriage, through obligation, as if free choice and personal honor weren't enough. She thought about her mother, who'd married for love and spent her last years fighting to breathe in a land that had no mercy for the weak. She thought about Sarah Henderson, holding her children close while armed men burned her barn. She thought about all the women she'd known who'd had their futures decided by fathers, by husbands, by men who never asked what they wanted. And she made a decision. Tomorrow she would speak to Neshoba, not as someone who needed rescuing, not as someone being offered like trade goods, but as one person to another. She would tell him the truth about the homestead, about the debt, about why her father was so desperate to find some way to repay what he saw as an impossible obligation. And then she would offer him a choice: stay and help them, or go. No obligations, no forced bonds, just choice. Because if there was one thing Rosalind Crane understood after 24 years of life, in a land that took more than it gave, it was that freedom, true freedom, was the most valuable thing a person could have. And she would not let her father's broken sense of honor steal that from either of them. The morning sun found Rosalind already walking across the hardpan toward Neshoba's camp, and with each step she felt the weight of a conversation she didn't know how to begin. He was awake. Probably had been for hours. The fire was cold, carefully scattered and covered. He sat on a flat rock, working on a piece of leather with steady, practiced movements. Repairing something, always doing something. It was a quality she recognized. That inability to rest when there was work to be done. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable in the early light. "You walk loud," he said, but there was no criticism in it. Just observation. "I'm not trying to sneak up on you," Rosalind replied, stopping a respectful distance away. I need to explain something about my father, about why he said what he said yesterday." Neshoba set aside his work, giving her his full attention. It was unsettling, that kind of focused listening. Most men she knew only half heard women, their minds already on the next task, or the next complaint. But Neshoba listened, as if her words mattered, as if she mattered. She told him everything. The full weight of their debt, the loans her father had taken when the drought started, believing, hoping that the next season would be better. The accumulated interest that grew like a tumor, doubling and tripling until the amount owed was more than the homestead could ever produce. The way Garrett had tried everything, selling livestock, taking odd jobs in town, even prospecting for a worthless silver claim that yielded nothing but blistered hands and disappointed dreams. "He used to be strong," Rosalind said, her voice catching despite her determination to stay composed. "He used to laugh. He'd swing me around when I was small and tell me I'd inherit an empire. But the land, it takes something from you when you fight it this long and keep losing. It takes your hope, and when my mother died, it took something else. His will to keep pretending things would get better." She explained how Garrett had been raised in Kentucky, in a culture where honor and obligation were woven into every interaction. Where debts of honor, debts that couldn't be measured in money, required personal sacrifice to balance. Where a man who took help and gave nothing in return was not considered a man at all. "He doesn't see me as property," Rosalind said, needing Neshoba to understand this. "He sees himself as a man with nothing left to offer except the one thing of value he still has. And in his mind, in his world, offering your daughter in marriage to repay a life debt is the highest honor he can give. It's not about taking away my choice. It's about him, desperately trying to be the man he was raised to be." Neshoba was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant. Then he spoke, and his words carried the weight of his own history. "My people have similar traditions," he said. "Obligations that pass through generations, debts that must be honored. I understand what drives your father, but—" He paused, choosing words carefully. Understanding why someone does something does not make it right. Tradition can be a guide, but when it harms people, when it takes away choice, it becomes a chain. He told her then about his own past, how he'd been raised in the traditional ways, learning to track and hunt and survive in the harshest desert, how he'd served as a scout during the conflicts with the cavalry, walking the impossible line between his people's needs and the inevitable tide of settlement, how he'd watched his own father struggle with the collision of two worlds, one that was ending, one that was beginning, and the pain of trying to maintain honor and tradition in a reality that no longer recognized either. "My father wanted me to marry a woman chosen by the elders," Neshoba said. "A good woman, strong, from a good family. It would have bound our clan to another, strengthened both. It was logical, traditional, honorable." He picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers. "But I barely knew her, and she barely knew me. And when I asked her what she wanted, she wept, because no one had ever asked her that before." "What did you do?" Rosalind asked softly. "I refused the marriage," Neshoba said simply. "I told the elders and I told my father that I would not bind myself or another person through obligation alone, that if I ever married, it would be to someone I chose, and who chose me. Not because of tradition or politics or family alliances, but because we wanted to walk through life together." "And your father?" "He was angry, hurt. He said I was rejecting our ways, rejecting him." Neshoba's voice was steady, but Rosalind could hear the old pain underneath. "He died 2 years later, still angry with me. We never reconciled, and I—" He paused. "I still believe I made the right choice, but the cost of that choice, the cost of refusing tradition when it conflicts with what you know is right, that cost is real, and it never fully goes away." They sat in silence for a while, two people from different worlds, united by the strange commonality of resisting the weight of expectation. Finally, Rosalind spoke again. "I won't marry you to satisfy my father's sense of honor," she said firmly, "but I also can't ask you to keep risking yourself for us when you owe us nothing. So I'm asking, not demanding. Will you stay? Will you help us defend the homestead until we can find some way to pay the debt or until we accept that it's lost? I can't pay you much. We barely have enough food for ourselves. But whatever we have, we'll share. And when Mortimer comes back with more men, if it becomes too dangerous, I want you to leave. I won't have another person die on this cursed piece of land." Neshoba studied her for a long moment, and Rosalind felt exposed under that gaze, as if he could see not just her words, but her intent, her fear, her determination, her bone-deep weariness with a struggle that seemed designed to break her. "I will stay," he said finally, "not for your father's honor, not for obligation. I will stay because—" He hesitated, and for the first time, Rosalind saw something like uncertainty in his expression. "Because you are fighting for something that matters. Because you have not given up, even when giving up would be easier. Because I have spent too much of my life watching people be crushed by forces they cannot control, and I am tired of only watching." Something loosened in Rosalind's chest. Relief, mixed with gratitude, mixed with something else she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said, "and I'm sorry. For my father putting you in that position, for—" "Do not apologize for his desperation," Neshoba interrupted gently. "Desperate people do not always think clearly. They reach for solutions that seem to solve problems without considering all the consequences. It is human. We have all done it." They walked back to the homestead together as the sun climbed higher, and Rosalind felt the strange sensation of having an ally. Not just help, but partnership. Someone who understood that the fight wasn't just against Mortimer and the development company. It was against a whole system designed to grind smallholders into dust. When they reached the house, Garrett was on the porch. He looked older in the morning light, diminished. His eyes went from Rosalind to Neshoba and back again, and she could see him trying to read what had passed between them. "Father," Rosalind said, her voice firm but not unkind, "Neshoba has agreed to help us, to stay and protect the homestead, but not because of any marriage arrangement, not because of any debt. He's staying because he chooses to, because he believes what's happening to us, to all the small holders, is wrong, and that's enough. That has to be enough." Garrett's jaw worked. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "A man pays his debts," he said, but there was less conviction in it now. "A man has honor." "Yes," Rosalind agreed. "A man has honor, and so does a woman. And part of honor, part of true honor, is respecting others' choices, respecting their freedom. You taught me that people own themselves. You taught me that no one has the right to force another person into service or marriage or anything else. You believed that once, and I need you to believe it again." She saw the impact of her words on his face, saw him wrestle with the contradiction between what he'd been taught about honor and debt, and what he'd once believed about human dignity and autonomy. It was like watching a man climb a steep cliff with no clear handholds, struggling, slipping, trying again. Finally, Garrett looked at Neshoba. "You're staying without obligation?" "I am staying," Neshoba confirmed. "And you ask nothing in return?" "I ask only what Miss Crane has offered, shelter and shared food while I'm here, nothing more." Garrett closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I don't know how to live with that," he whispered. "I don't know how to accept help I can't repay." "Then learn," Neshoba said, and his voice was not harsh, but direct. "Learn to accept that sometimes people help because it is right to help. Learn to see strength in receiving as well as giving. Learn that honor does not always mean sacrifice. Sometimes it means allowing others to show you kindness without demanding payment." It was perhaps the longest speech Rosalind had heard Neshoba make, and every word of it struck true. Garrett sat there, trembling slightly, his old world crumbling around him, and no clear vision of what would replace it. Then slowly he nodded. Just once, a tiny movement. But it was enough. The day passed in a strange new rhythm. Neshoba scouted the property's boundaries, looking for the best defensive positions and possible approaches for armed men. Rosalind worked on repairing irrigation channels, her mind only half on the task as she processed the morning's conversation. Garrett remained on the porch, watching them both with an expression that cycled between confusion, shame, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. That evening, they shared a meal, simple beans and cornbread, but Neshoba ate as if it were a feast, thanking them with genuine gratitude. And in that moment, sitting at a rough wooden table with the lamp flickering and the night pressing against the windows, Rosalind felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but maybe the shadow of it. The possibility that survival might be more than just delaying the inevitable. But outside, in the darkness, forces were gathering. Silas Mortimer was not a man who accepted humiliation twice, and the Santa Fe Development Company did not stop simply because one Apache stood in their way. They would come again, with more men, with better plans, with absolute determination to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. And when they came, everyone at the Crane homestead would face a choice. How much were they willing to sacrifice? How far would they go? And what did honor truly mean when the law itself was corrupted by power and greed? These questions hung in the air like the dust, settling on everything, changing nothing, and waiting for the storm that everyone knew was coming. 5 days passed like a held breath, and in that temporary peace, small transformations began to take root. Neshoba proved to be more than just a protector. He knew the land in ways that Rosalind, despite years of working it, had never considered. He showed her how to read the way water moved underground by watching where certain plants grew. He taught her to find seeps and springs she'd never noticed, hidden sources of moisture that could extend their irrigation. He even helped repair the windmill that had stood broken for 6 months, his clever hands understanding machinery as well as they understood tracking and survival. Garrett watched these activities from his porch, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, he began to move again. First, just walking to the barn, then helping to sort tools, then actually picking up a hammer and repairing fence posts. Small things, but for a man who'd been broken, small things were monumental. And Rosalind found herself watching Neshoba when she thought he wasn't looking, not with romantic fascination, at least that's what she told herself, but with growing respect and curiosity. He was so different from the men she'd known, the settlers and ranchers who spoke loudly and moved through the world as if noise and bluster equaled strength. Neshoba moved quietly, spoke sparingly, but there was an intensity to him, a sense of purpose that drew her attention like iron to a lodestone. On the third evening, they sat together near the well after supper, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Rosalind had been working up the courage to ask him something. And finally, the words came. "Why did you really stay?" she asked. "I know what you said, about choosing to help, about right and wrong, but there are dozens of homesteads struggling out here, dozens of families facing the same thing we are. Why US specifically?" Neshoba was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Do you know what it's like to watch your world disappear?" he asked. "Not quickly, in battle or disaster, but slowly, piece by piece. The hunting grounds closed off, the water sources claimed, the old paths made illegal to travel. My people, we have watched the life we knew become impossible. And for a long time, I was angry. So angry, I could barely see." He picked up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers. "I blamed the settlers, all of them, every wagon train, every homestead, every fence. I saw them as the enemy, as the force destroying everything I loved, and I was not wrong to be angry. What happened, what is still happening, is an injustice beyond measure." "But then," Rosalind prompted gently. "But then I started seeing the individuals," Neshoba continued. "Not just the mass of settlement, but the people. Families like the Hendersons who shared water with me when I was tracking bandits. An old Mexican woman in Socorro who gave me food even though she barely had enough for herself. A homesteader who let me sleep in his barn during a storm and never asked for payment. And I realized, most of these people are not the enemy. They are just people trying to survive. Just like my people are trying to survive." He turned to look at her directly. "The real enemy is not the homesteaders or even the Apache. It's the men like Mortimer, the land companies, the politicians and businessmen who profit from setting us against each other. They want us fighting over scraps while they feast. And I'm tired of playing the role they've assigned me, tired of being the savage who resists civilization. I would rather be a man who helps where help is needed, regardless of who needs it." Rosalind absorbed this, feeling the weight of his words. "That must be lonely," she said quietly, "not fitting fully into either world, being caught between." "Yes," Neshoba agreed simply. "Very lonely, but loneliness is better than being complicit in cruelty, and maybe—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Maybe there is a third way, not the old way of my people which is dying. Not the way of the settlers, which consumes everything it touches, but something new, something that takes wisdom from both and rejects the worst of both. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I think it starts with small choices, like choosing to protect your homestead." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, and Rosalind felt something shift inside her. This was not the simple story she'd grown up with. Settlers versus savages, civilization versus wilderness. This was something more complex, more human, and somehow more hopeful even in its difficulty. But hope was fragile in the territory, and forces were moving that would test it to breaking. On the morning of the 6th day, a rider came. Not one of Mortimer's men, but a young boy, couldn't have been more than 14, from the town of Bitter Creek, 8 miles south. He was dusty and exhausted, his horse lathered with sweat. He'd been riding to all the homesteads in the valley carrying a message. There was to be a gathering, all the landowners who were facing pressure from the Santa Fe Development Company, meeting in 3 days at the Bitter Creek schoolhouse. Someone, he didn't know who, had sent word that they needed to organize, to stand together, to find some way to resist the systematic seizure of their properties. Garrett wanted to go immediately. For the first time in months, Rosalind saw real energy in him. "This is what we need," he said, pacing the porch with more vitality than he'd shown in a year. "Unity, organization. If we all stand together, they can't take us all. There's power in numbers, Rosalind, real power." But Neshoba was less certain. "It could be legitimate," he said, studying the message the boy had brought. "Or it could be a trap. Get all the resistors in one place, away from their homesteads, make them vulnerable." "You think Mortimer would?" Rosalind began, then stopped. Of course he would. Men like Mortimer used every advantage, exploited every opening. If he could draw the homesteaders away from their properties, he could seize multiple claims at once, or worse, much worse. Garrett's face fell as the implication sank in. "So we do nothing? We just wait here for them to come for us individually?" "No," Neshoba said thoughtfully. "We investigate. I will go to Bitter Creek. I will see who called this meeting and whether it's legitimate. You both stay here and defend the homestead if needed. If it's real, if there truly is a chance to organize resistance, then we decide together how to proceed." He left within the hour, moving fast on foot. Faster, he explained, than most horses could maintain over distance. He'd be in Bitter Creek by nightfall, would observe the situation and return with information, 2 days, 3 at most. Watching him disappear into the shimmering heat, Rosalind felt a sudden twist of anxiety. Not just fear for their safety without him, but fear for him. What if this was the trap? What if Mortimer was specifically targeting Neshoba, the one obstacle that had thwarted him twice? "He'll be fine," Garrett said, as if reading her thoughts. "That man, he's survived things that would kill most of us. He'll be fine." But his words lacked conviction, because they both knew that even the strongest, most skilled person could fall to a bullet from ambush, could be overwhelmed by numbers, could simply be in the wrong place when luck ran out. The first day without Neshoba crawled past like a wounded animal. Every sound made Rosalind jump. Was it horses approaching? Was it Mortimer's men coming while their protector was gone? She kept the rifle close, checked and rechecked the ammunition, and barely slept. Garrett, to his credit, stayed alert as well. Whatever had been awakened in him over the past week continued to grow. He cleaned his own rifle, positioned himself where he could watch the main approach, and spoke to Rosalind with a clarity she hadn't heard in years. "I'm sorry," he said on the second evening, the words coming suddenly as they prepared a simple meal, "for trying to trade you, for thinking I had the right to bargain with your life. Your mother would have been ashamed of me. I'm ashamed of me." Rosalind looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw a man trying to climb back from a dark place. "You were trying to survive," she said, "trying to protect us the only way you knew how. I understand that. But, Father, you have to understand something too. I'm not a child anymore. I haven't been for a long time. You can't make decisions about my life without me. Not about marriage, not about anything. If we're going to survive this, we survive it as partners, as equals, or we don't survive it at all." Garrett nodded slowly, and something in his posture changed. a relaxing, an acceptance. "Partners then," he said. "Equals. God knows you've been carrying this place mostly on your own anyway. It's about time I acknowledged it." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no tears or dramatic embraces. But it was real, a small shift in a relationship that had been unbalanced for too long, and in the territory where survival was measured in small victories, it mattered. Neshoba returned on the afternoon of the third day, and Rosalind felt a wave of relief so strong it left her momentarily weak-kneed. He looked tired but unharmed, his face thoughtful. The meeting was legitimate, mostly. There was a real organizer, a lawyer from Santa Fe named Marcus Webb, who'd been fighting the development company through legal channels. He'd called the homesteaders together to discuss a coordinated defense strategy, filing group complaints, pooling resources for better legal representation, creating a network so that if one property was threatened, others would know and could come to help. "It's a good plan," Neshoba said, "in theory. But there's a problem." "What problem?" Garrett asked. "Mortimer knows about it," Neshoba replied. "I saw 2 of his men watching the schoolhouse. They're taking names, recording who attends. And I heard them talking. The company plans to make examples. They'll target the leaders of any resistance, hard, fast, brutally, to show what happens to those who organize against them." Rosalind felt her stomach drop. "So it's damned if we do, damned if we don't. Organize and become targets. Or don't organize and get picked off one by one." "Yes," Neshoba said simply. "That's exactly the situation. The development company has created a trap with no good exit. They have legal backing, financial resources, and willingness to use violence. The homesteaders have numbers, but numbers mean nothing if people are too afraid to act." Garrett sat heavily in his chair. "So what do we do?" Neshoba was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful precision. "We make a choice. We can abandon this land, walk away, start over somewhere else. Many of the homesteaders are considering it. Or—" he paused. "Or we stand, knowing that standing might cost us everything, but also knowing that if enough people stand, if enough people refuse to be moved, the company's whole strategy collapses. They profit from fear and isolation. Take those away, and they're just men with papers. Powerful, yes, but not invincible. Not." "You're talking about a fight," Rosalind said. "Not just a legal fight, a real one." "I'm talking about resistance," Neshoba corrected, "which takes many forms: legal action, public pressure, mutual defense, and yes, if necessary, physical resistance against those who use physical force against you. The law is supposed to protect you, but when the law is bought and paid for by those who want to take your land, you have to protect yourself." Rosalind looked at her father, then back at Neshoba. In that moment, she understood that this was the pivot point, the place where everything would be decided. They could run, take what little they had, and flee to some other place, some other hope. Or they could plant their feet and say no, say this is ours, say you cannot simply take what belongs to others because you have money and lawyers and guns. "I'm staying," she said, her voice steady. "This is my mother's grave. This is 3 years of my labor. This is home, even if it's a broken, drought-stricken, debt-ridden home. I'm staying, and if they want it, they'll have to drag me off it." Garrett looked at his daughter with something like awe. Then he straightened in his chair, and for just a moment, he looked like the man he'd been before the land broke him. "Then I'm staying too," he said, "and God help anyone who tries to take what's ours." They both looked at Neshoba, who nodded slowly. "Then we prepare," he said, "because they will come, and when they do, we'll be ready." Preparation took many forms, and in the days that followed, the Crane homestead transformed from a dying ranch into something that resembled a fortress. Neshoba worked with a precision born of military experience. He identified every approach to the property and established defensive positions. He taught Rosalind and Garrett how to create obstacles that would slow riders, trenches disguised with brush, wire strung low between posts, carefully positioned rocks that would force horsemen into predictable paths. Nothing that would stop a determined assault, but everything designed to give them warning and advantage. He also rode to the neighboring homesteads, the Hendersons, the Vasquez family to the west, the widow Patterson 3 miles south. He spoke to each of them about what was coming, about the need to watch out for each other, about signal fires and alarm shots, about the simple truth that isolation was the company's greatest weapon against them. Some listened. Others were too frightened or too beaten down to consider resistance, but enough agreed, enough to form the skeleton of something larger, a network, a community of mutual defense that could respond when any single homestead was threatened. "It's not an army," Neshoba told Rosalind, as they worked on reinforcing the barn doors. "But it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be enough to make attacking any single property more trouble than it's worth. The company wants easy victories. We make it hard, and they'll look for easier targets. Or they'll escalate," Rosalind countered, hammering a support beam into place. "They'll bring in more men, better guns. They'll make such an example of someone that everyone else breaks and runs." "Perhaps," Neshoba agreed, "but fear is not a reason to surrender before the fight even begins. You fight when you must, and you fight smart. That's all anyone can do." Garrett, meanwhile, had discovered something valuable in the attic. Old military maps from his father's time serving in the Mexican War. They showed the valley's geography in detail, including features that had since been forgotten. Old trails, hidden arroyos, places where small groups could move unseen or set up observations. He spread these maps on the kitchen table and studied them with the focus of a general planning a campaign. "Here," he said, pointing to a ridge overlooking their property. "If Mortimer's smart, he'll position men here during an assault. Good sight lines. Can direct the attack. We need someone up there first, watching, warning us when they come." Neshoba studied the map and nodded approvingly. "Your father was a soldier. Captain in the infantry," Garrett said, and there was old pride in his voice. "Fought at Buena Vista and Cerro Gordo. He understood tactics, taught me some before he died. I'd forgotten, let myself forget, but it's coming back." It was more than tactics returning. Garrett was returning. The fog of depression and defeat that had consumed him was lifting, not completely, but enough that Rosalind could see glimpses of who her father had been, who he might become again. Purpose, she realized, was powerful medicine for a broken spirit. The summons came on a grey morning when storm clouds gathered over the mountains but refused to release their rain. A rider, a sheriff's deputy from Bitter Creek, brought official papers, legal documents that gave the Crane family 30 days to vacate the property or face forcible removal. The debt had been called in full by the Santa Fe Development Company, and the territorial court had ruled in their favor. Garrett read the papers with shaking hands, his face going pale. 30 days, he whispered. After all this, 30 days. But Rosalind took the papers from him and read them more carefully. She'd learned something about legal documents over the past years, had studied them in town, trying to understand the mechanisms that were crushing them. And something in this particular notice was wrong. "This signature," she said, pointing. "Judge Blackwell supposedly signed this. But Judge Blackwell died 4 months ago. His replacement is Judge Cordova. This is a fake, or at best, it's an old document that was never properly executed." The deputy, a young man who looked uncomfortable with his assignment, shifted his weight. "I'm just delivering what I was told to deliver, ma'am. You have questions about its legitimacy, you take it up with the court." "We will," Rosalind said firmly. "You tell Silas Mortimer that we'll see him in court, with proper jurisdiction, and we'll bring these documents and let a real judge determine if they're legal." The deputy nodded and left quickly, clearly relieved to be away from the tension. When he was gone, Neshoba smiled, actually smiled, for the first time since Rosalind had met him. "You would have made a good lawyer," he said. "You see the details others miss." "My mother taught me to read carefully," Rosalind replied. "She said powerful people count on others being too tired or scared to question what they're told. She said careful reading was a form of resistance." "Your mother was wise," Neshoba said simply. But the fake documents, while revealing, also confirmed what they'd suspected. The development company was moving beyond even the pretense of legality. They were manufacturing justifications for seizures they'd already decided to make, which meant the legal battle, such as it was, had already been lost. All that remained was the physical confrontation. It came 3 days later, but not in the way anyone expected. Mortimer didn't bring his hired guns to the Crane homestead. Instead, he went to the Hendersons' place, the same family Neshoba had protected weeks before. But this time, he came with 20 men, armed, organized, overwhelming, and he didn't bother with warnings or negotiations. He simply burned everything: the house, the rebuilt barn, the equipment. Everything the Henderson family owned consumed in flames while they were held at gunpoint and forced to watch. Then Mortimer gave them a wagon, supplies for 1 week, and directions to the nearest town. "Tell everyone what happened here," he said, loud enough for his men to hear. "Tell them this is what resistance gets you. Tell them the Santa Fe Development Company will not be stopped by one Apache or a handful of stubborn homesteaders. Tell them to take their 30-day notices seriously, or this is what awaits them." The Hendersons were driven off their land like cattle, like refugees in their own territory, and the message was clear. This was war, not the legal kind, not the civilized kind, but the brutal, scorched earth kind, where mercy was a weakness and compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Neshoba brought the news. He'd been watching from a distance, unable to stop 20 armed men without starting a massacre. His face was carved from stone when he returned, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "They're coming here next," he said. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after, but soon. And they won't give warnings. They'll come to destroy, to make an example that terrifies every other homesteader into submission." "Then we leave," Garrett said, but there was no conviction in it. "We take what we can carry and we—" "No!" Rosalind interrupted, her voice hard. "No, we don't run. We don't let them win. If we run, they've won. If everyone runs, they've won everything. And this will keep happening in this valley, in the next. Everywhere there are people trying to make a life, and there are powerful men who want what they have." She stood up, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "I know we can't beat 20 armed men. I know that. But we can make it cost them. We can make it difficult. We can send word to every homesteader in the valley about what happened to the Hendersons. We can make sure that when they come for us, when they burn our home, everyone knows, everyone sees, everyone understands what the Santa Fe Development Company really is." "Martyrdom," Neshoba said quietly. "You're talking about martyrdom." "I'm talking about witness," Rosalind corrected fiercely, "about not letting them do this in the dark, about making sure that even if we lose, even if they take everything, the truth of what they are gets told, gets spread, gets remembered." Garrett looked at his daughter with something like wonder. "When did you become so fierce?" he asked softly. "When I had no other choice," Rosalind replied. "When I realized that being gentle and compliant and hoping for mercy just meant dying slowly instead of quickly. I'm done hoping for mercy from men who have none." Neshoba was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he spoke, and his words carried weight. "There's another option," he said. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We go to them, not to fight. We'd lose, but to confront, publicly, in town, in front of witnesses. We force Mortimer to either back down or commit his violence where everyone can see it. Take away the isolation, take away the darkness, make him show his true nature in the light." It was a dangerous plan, possibly a fatal one, but it had one advantage. It turned their greatest weakness into a potential strength. They couldn't win a physical fight, but they could win a moral one. They could expose the development company's tactics in a way that might create enough public outrage to change the equation. "We'd need others," Garrett said, his tactical mind engaging. "As many homesteaders as we can gather. If it's just us, we're easy to dismiss. But if it's dozens, if it's families and children and old people all standing together, that's harder to ignore, harder to brutalize without consequences." "The meeting," Rosalind said suddenly. "The one Marcus Webb called. He was trying to organize exactly this kind of collective action. If we can get word to him, if we can coordinate." Neshoba nodded slowly. "I'll go. Tonight, I'll ride to Bitter Creek and find Webb. If he's legitimate, if he's truly trying to help, then this is the moment. This is when all the preparation and organizing becomes action." He left within the hour, riding this time on temperance because speed mattered more than stealth. Rosalind and Garrett watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, and then they began their own preparations. Not for defense this time, but for something harder, for confrontation, for putting themselves in harm's way deliberately, trusting that public witness would provide a protection that weapons never could. They wrote everything down, every detail of the debt, the fake legal documents, the intimidation, the burning of the Henderson place. They made multiple copies, sealing them in oilcloth to protect against weather or fire. Some would be carried on them, others would be hidden around the property. If they died, if the worst happened, the truth would survive them. Rosalind also wrote a letter to her brother Thomas, wherever he was, explaining everything, asking him to forgive their father, telling him that she loved him and hoped he'd found the better life he'd gone east to seek. She sealed it carefully and addressed it to the last place he'd written from, a prayer sent into the void, hoping it would reach someone who cared. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stood on the porch in the darkness, looking at stars that burned with cold indifference above the struggles of humans. Her mother was buried on the hill. 3 years of her sweat and blood were soaked into this land, and tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after, she would stand in front of men who wanted to take it all and say no. Say you cannot have this without a fight, without witnesses, without the truth being told. She wasn't naive enough to think truth alone would save them. Power rarely cared about truth, but sometimes bearing witness was enough. Sometimes refusing to let injustice happen in silence was its own form of victory, even in defeat. Garrett joined her on the porch, moving quietly for a man his size. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "Not of the situation we're in, but of who you've become, how you've fought." "I learned it from her," Rosalind said. "She fought every day, against the land, against the illness, against despair. She fought until there was nothing left to fight with, and even then, even in those last days, she never stopped hoping that tomorrow might be better." "Hope," Garrett repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. "I lost that, for a long time. But watching you these past weeks, watching Neshoba, I think maybe hope isn't about believing things will be better. Maybe it's about choosing to act as if they could be, even when all evidence suggests otherwise." Rosalind reached out and took her father's hand. It was rough and scarred from decades of hard labor, a working man's hand, a survivor's hand. "Then we choose hope," she said. "Tomorrow we choose hope. And whatever happens after that, at least we'll have chosen it together." They stood there in the darkness, father and daughter, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. The sun rose on what might be the last day of their old lives, and Bitter Creek woke to find its streets filling with people who'd been invisible for too long. Neshoba had succeeded. Marcus Webb, the lawyer from Santa Fe, had spread the word through his network. And they came, the struggling homesteaders, the debt-burdened ranchers, the families facing seizure and displacement. They came in wagons and on horseback and some on foot, old people leaning on sticks, children wide-eyed with uncertainty, women carrying babies, men carrying the weight of failing to protect what they'd built. They gathered in the center of town, in front of the territorial courthouse and the Santa Fe Development Company's regional office. Not armed, Neshoba had been clear about that. No guns, no weapons, nothing that could be used to paint them as violent or dangerous, just people, standing together, visible, refusing to be picked off quietly in the isolation of their scattered properties. Rosalind stood with her father on one side and Neshoba on the other. She wore her cleanest dress, still stained with work, still patched in places, but her head was high. Around them, perhaps 60 people had gathered. It wasn't a huge crowd, but in a small territory town it was significant, it was noticeable. Marcus Webb stood on the courthouse steps. He was younger than Rosalind expected, maybe 30, with intense eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the kind of energy that suggested he was fueled more by conviction than food. He spoke in a voice trained for courtrooms, carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "We are here today as witnesses," he said. "Witnesses to an injustice that has been happening in darkness and isolation for too long. The Santa Fe Development Company has been systematically seizing homesteads across this valley using debt manipulation, falsified documents, and outright intimidation. They've burned homes, they've threatened families, they've driven people off land they've worked for years, all in the name of legal foreclosure and development." He held up the documents Rosalind had provided. These papers claim to authorize the seizure of the Crane homestead, but they're signed by a judge who's been dead for 4 months. This isn't isolated incompetence. This is systematic fraud, and it's happening to dozens of families across the territory. A murmur ran through the crowd. Anger, fear, recognition. These were people who'd been carrying the weight of similar injustices alone, and suddenly they were surrounded by others who understood, who shared the burden, who believed them. The development company's response came quickly. The office doors opened, and Silas Mortimer emerged with 4 of his men. Not the full force he'd brought to burn the Henderson place, but enough to project authority, enough to threaten. "This is an illegal assembly," Mortimer announced, his voice hard. "You're trespassing on company property and disrupting legitimate business. I'm calling for the sheriff to disperse you. Go home, peacefully, or face the consequences." "We're on public streets," Webb countered immediately, "standing on public ground, exercising our right to petition for redress of grievances. If you want to discuss illegal activity, let's talk about falsified legal documents and arson." Mortimer's face darkened. "Careful, lawyer. You're making accusations you can't prove." "Can't I?" Webb produced more documents, thick stacks of them. "I have testimony from 18 families about intimidation tactics. I have documentation of debts that were sold and resold until the interest exceeded the principal by 5 times. I have evidence of properties seized and then immediately transferred to company executives at a fraction of their value. And I have this," he held up a charred piece of wood, "taken from the Henderson property, burned yesterday, while a 20-man armed force held the family at gunpoint. Multiple witnesses can testify to what happened. Do you want to keep claiming this is all legal and proper?" The crowd had grown. Townspeople were emerging from shops and homes, drawn by the commotion. This was exactly what Neshoba had predicted, the power of public witness. In the isolation of scattered homesteads, Mortimer could do almost anything. But here, in front of dozens of eyes, his options narrowed. Mortimer's hand moved toward his coat, toward a weapon, and in that moment, everything hung on the thinnest edge. Would he escalate? Would he risk violence in front of all these witnesses? Would his desire to maintain control overcome his political calculation? Neshoba moved then, not aggressively, but deliberately. He stepped forward, placing himself between Mortimer and the crowd, between the weapon and the people. And when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. "You can shoot me," Neshoba said. "You probably could before I could stop you. But then what? You'll have killed an Apache scout in front of 60 witnesses in the middle of town, on a day when people came peacefully to address grievances. And every newspaper from here to Santa Fe will hear about it. Every politician, every voter. Is that what the development company wants? Is that the story you want told?" The silence that followed was absolute. Mortimer's hand remained near his coat, but it didn't move further. His eyes darted across the crowd, calculating, assessing, and Rosalind could see the moment the equation changed for him, the moment he realized that the old tactics, the ones that worked in isolation, wouldn't work here. "This isn't over," Mortimer said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "The company has legal rights. We will pursue them through proper channels, and when the law rules in our favor, which it will, you'll all be removed. Legally, properly, and there won't be anything your Apache protector or your lawyer can do about it." He turned and walked back into the office, his men following. But there was something different in how they moved. Not the swagger of men who owned the situation, but the caution of people who just realized the ground had shifted beneath them. The crowd erupted in conversation, excited, nervous, uncertain. Marcus Webb raised his hands for attention. "This is a beginning," he said loudly. "Only a beginning. They'll regroup. They'll come at us through the courts and through pressure and through every angle they can find. But today we showed them something important. We showed them we're not isolated, we're not helpless, we're organized, and we're willing to stand in the light and demand justice." He explained the next steps: formal complaints filed with the territorial governor, affidavits collected from every family who'd been victimized, a petition to investigate the development company's practices, legal challenges to every seizure. It was complicated and would take months, maybe years, but it was momentum, it was resistance given form and structure. "None of this guarantees success," Webb cautioned. "The company has money and political connections we don't have. But they need legitimacy, they need to appear lawful, and if we can strip away that appearance, if we can show the territory and the federal government what they really are, we have a chance, not a certainty, but a chance." As the crowd slowly dispersed, families returning to their endangered homesteads, Rosalind felt exhausted, but strangely lighter. They hadn't won anything concrete. The debt still existed, the threats remained. But something fundamental had changed. They were no longer alone, no longer silent, no longer invisible. Carl Henderson approached them, his face haggard from what he'd endured. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at Neshoba and then at Rosalind, "for what you did, for organizing this. Sarah wants to give up, to move back east, and maybe we will. But at least now she knows we tried, that we didn't just accept what happened, that we stood up." "Where will you go?" Rosalind asked gently. "My brother's place in Missouri," Carl replied. "He's got a farm. Says he can use help. It's not what I wanted, not what I built. But," he shrugged, defeated, "sometimes survival means knowing when to retreat. I don't judge anyone who stays, but I don't have another fight left in me." After he left, Garrett spoke quietly. "That could be us, should maybe be us. We could walk away right now. Leave the debt and the homestead and all of it. Start fresh somewhere else." "Is that what you want?" Rosalind asked. Garrett was silent for a long time, staring at the mountains that ringed their valley. "No," he said finally. "No, it's not. I'm tired of running, tired of surrendering, tired of being a man who lets others dictate his fate. If we're going to lose that homestead, I want to lose it fighting. I want to know that I stood for something at the end, that I didn't just give up and die quietly. Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes. This was her father, the real man beneath the broken exterior, the man her mother had married, the man who'd once crossed a continent to build something from nothing. "Then we go home," she said, "and we fight, however long it takes." The ride back to the homestead took several hours. Nashoba rode alongside them, quiet and watchful, as always. But as they approached their property, he spoke. "This will get harder before it gets easier," he said. "Mortimer will be more dangerous now because he's been humiliated publicly. The company will escalate, use different tactics, legal pressure, economic pressure. They might even go through proper channels now, which means longer battles, more uncertainty. But we have time now," Rosalind said. "Time we didn't have before. Time to organize, to prepare, to find alternatives." "Perhaps," Nashoba agreed, "or perhaps we've only delayed the inevitable, but—" He paused, and something like a smile touched his face. "Delay is sometimes all that's needed. The world changes. Attitudes shift. What seems impossible today becomes possible tomorrow. My people know this well. We've been delaying our extinction for generations, and we're still here." When they reached the homestead, the sun was setting, painting the broken land in colors of copper and gold. The house still stood. The barn still stood. Her mother's grave on the hill still overlooked it all. It wasn't much. It would never be the empire her father had dreamed of, but it was theirs, and they'd fought to keep it. That evening they shared a meal, simple but sufficient, and for the first time in memory there was conversation that wasn't weighed down by despair. Garrett spoke about defensive positions and legal strategies. Rosalind talked about water conservation and crop rotation for if the drought broke. And Nashoba shared stories from his people about perseverance and adaptation in the face of overwhelming change. As darkness fell, Nashoba prepared to return to his camp. But Garrett stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Stay," he said. "In the house. We have a spare room. It's not much, but you're family now. Not because of any debt or obligation, but because you've stood with us. Because you've chosen to stand with us, and that makes you family." Nashoba looked at Garrett, then at Rosalind, surprise visible in his normally controlled expression. He paused, seeming to search for words. "I would be honored." They settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. The legal battles that Marcus Webb had initiated ground forward at the slow pace of territorial bureaucracy. Some homesteaders left, the pressure too much, the hope too thin. But others stayed, and slowly, painfully, a network of mutual support solidified. Shared resources, shared labor, shared resistance. Mortimer and the development company shifted tactics exactly as Nashoba had predicted. Instead of direct confrontation, they pursued seizures through proper legal channels. But those channels moved slowly, and every step was documented, challenged, appealed. What had once been quick and brutal became tedious and expensive. The company was used to easy victories. These hard-fought battles cost them time and money they hadn't anticipated. And in that time, things changed. A new territorial governor was appointed, one less friendly to the development companies that had dominated land policy. A newspaper in Santa Fe picked up the story of the homesteader resistance, and suddenly public opinion, fickle and unreliable as it was, began to shift. What had been seen as inevitable progress was now questioned as potential corruption. The drought finally broke in late September. Rain came, not the deluge they'd prayed for, but steady autumn rains that soaked into the grateful earth. And with the rain came possibility. The land could produce again. The debts could potentially be worked down. Survival was no longer just delay. It was genuine hope. Rosalind stood in the garden one evening, watching green shoots emerge from soil that had been dead grey for years. Neshoba worked nearby, repairing the irrigation system they'd rebuilt together. And Garrett, stronger now, clearer in mind, was actually planning for the spring planting. "Do you ever think about what might have happened?" Rosalind asked Neshoba. "If you hadn't intervened at the Henderson place that first time, if you'd just ridden past and let events unfold without you?" Neshoba considered this, his hands never stopping their work. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But dwelling on alternate paths serves no purpose. We make choices. Those choices have consequences. And then we make new choices based on those consequences. That's all any of us can do." "My father tried to trade me to you," Rosalind said, the words coming out unexpectedly, "to bind you through marriage. And I was so angry, so furious that he thought he had that right. But looking back, I think maybe it wasn't about owning me. It was about him being so broken. He couldn't see any other way to make things right. He couldn't accept help without payment. Couldn't accept that someone might stand with us just because it was the right thing to do." "And now?" Neshoba asked. "Now he's learning," Rosalind said. "Learning that honor isn't always about grand gestures and equal exchanges. Sometimes honor is accepting help, offering help, building something together without constantly calculating who owes whom. It's a different kind of honor than he was taught, but maybe a better one." Neshoba nodded slowly. "My father never learned that," he said quietly. "He died angry because I wouldn't follow tradition, wouldn't accept an arranged marriage, wouldn't be bound by obligations I didn't choose, and I wish I could tell him that refusing those chains didn't mean I rejected him, or our people, or our traditions. It just meant I needed to find my own path, my own way of honoring what matters." "Maybe he knew," Rosalind offered. "Maybe in the end he understood even if he couldn't say it." "Perhaps," Neshoba said, but his voice carried doubt. They worked in comfortable silence as the light faded, and Rosalind found herself thinking about futures. Not the grand futures her father had once dreamed of, empires of land and cattle, but smaller, more honest futures. A homestead that produced enough to live on, neighbors who helped each other, communities that stood together against those who would exploit them. And maybe other things too. She glanced at Neshoba, working steadily in the gathering dusk, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the dramatic romance of storybooks, but something steadier. Respect that had deepened into friendship. Friendship that held the possibility of something more, not because of obligation or debt or desperate bargains, but because they'd chosen, day after day, to stand together, to work together, to build something together. "Neshoba," she said, surprising herself with the boldness, "when this is settled, when the legal battles are done and the homestead is secure, what will you do? Will you stay, or will you move on to whatever comes next?" He stopped working and looked at her directly. In the dimming light, his eyes were dark and unreadable. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been moving for so long, never staying anywhere, never putting down roots. Always the outsider, the one between worlds. It's lonely, but it's also safe. Staying means risk, means commitment, means choosing a place and people, and accepting that choice fully." "Yes," Rosalind agreed. "It does mean all that. But maybe loneliness and safety aren't actually safe at all. Maybe they're just slower ways of dying than physical danger." Neshoba smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "You are very wise for someone so young," he said, "and very brave. Braver than I am, I think." "I don't feel brave," Rosalind admitted. "I feel terrified most of the time. Terrified of losing the homestead, terrified of my father slipping back into that dark place, terrified of—" She paused, then pushed forward. "Terrified of hoping for things that might not happen, wanting things I might not be allowed to have." "What do you want?" Neshoba asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, simple, direct, dangerous, because answering it meant admitting things she'd barely admitted to herself, meant making herself vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with debts or development companies or legal battles. "I want this homestead to survive," Rosalind said carefully. "I want my father to stay healthy and strong. I want the rain to keep coming and the land to produce. I want the community we're building to last, and I want—" She took a breath. "I want you to stay, not because of obligation, not because we need protection, but because I've come to value your presence, your partnership, your—" She couldn't quite finish. Nashoba was silent for a long moment. Then he set down his tools and moved closer, not touching, but near. Close enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, close enough to feel the warmth of another person breaking the evening chill. "I'm not an easy man to be with," he said quietly. "I carry the weight of two worlds and belong fully to neither. I have skills for tracking and fighting, but few for peaceful living. I'm too quiet, too serious, too—" He searched for words. "Too marked by violence and loss to ever be truly carefree." "I'm not looking for carefree," Rosalind said. "I'm looking for real, for someone who understands what it means to fight for survival, for someone who sees me as a partner, not property, for someone who—" She met his eyes directly. "For someone who chooses to be here not because he has to, but because he wants to." "Then I choose to stay," Nashoba said, and his voice was steady despite the enormity of what he was saying. "Not just for the legal battles, not just until the homestead is secure. I choose to stay because you are right. Loneliness and safety are slow deaths, and I am tired of dying slowly. I want to live here with you, with your father, building something that matters." Rosalind felt tears on her face, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief, from the sensation of a weight she'd been carrying alone suddenly being shared. "No obligations," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "No debts, just choice. Every day, we wake up and choose this, choose each other, choose the work and the struggle and the hope, and if someday one of us needs to choose differently, we'll be honest about that too." "No obligations," Nashoba agreed. "Just choice." He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. It was calloused and work-worn, matching her own. Two people shaped by hard labor and harder choices. And in that moment, holding hands in the gathering darkness, with the smell of rain-blessed earth around them, Rosalind felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not the absence of struggle or danger, but the presence of partnership, of not being alone, of facing the future, whatever it held, with someone who'd chosen to face it with her. When they returned to the house, Garrett was on the porch. He looked at them, at their joined hands, and something soft crossed his weathered face. "Your mother would like him," he said simply. "She always valued quiet strength over loud bravado. And she always said the best relationships were partnerships, two people choosing each other every day." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Nashoba said. "She was," Garrett agreed, "and stubborn. Lord, was she stubborn. Wouldn't give up on this place even when it was clearly killing her. Wouldn't give up on me even when I was barely worth the effort. She believed that home wasn't a place. It was people choosing to stand together, no matter how hard the standing got." He stood, moving more easily than he had in years. "I'm going to bed," he announced. "You two talk. Or don't talk. Whatever you need. Just be careful with each other. Hearts are fragile things, even when they seem strong." After he'd gone inside, Rosalind and Nashoba sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching, watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The future was still uncertain. The legal battles weren't won. The drought might return. 100 disasters could still befall them, but for now, for this moment, they had what mattered. Choice, partnership, hope, and the strange, powerful knowledge that they didn't have to face whatever came next alone. "Tell me about your people," Rosalind said eventually. "Not the history that everyone knows, but the small things, the daily things. What made you laugh as a child? What stories did your mother tell? What do you miss most?" And Nashoba, who rarely spoke of personal things, began to talk. About summer camps in the mountains, about his mother's songs, about learning to track with his grandfather, who could read the desert like most men read books, about the feeling of belonging to a community, even when that community was struggling and changing and facing impossible pressures. In return, Rosalind spoke of her own memories, her mother's garden before the drought, her brother's laughter before he'd left, the feeling of the land in spring when everything was alive and growing and possible, the dreams she'd had as a girl, small dreams, humble dreams, but dreams nonetheless. They talked until the moon was high and the chill drove them inside, and when they finally parted to their separate rooms, Rosalind lay in her narrow bed feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, the situation was still too precarious for that, but contentment, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the people who mattered, and that, in a world that offered so few certainties, was more than enough. The epilogue of their story didn't come quickly or dramatically. There was no single moment of triumph, no final victory that solved everything. Life in the territory was never that simple. But over the following years, things did change. The legal challenges that Marcus Webb and others pursued eventually resulted in reforms to how development companies could seize property. Not perfect reforms, but enough to slow the wholesale theft that had been occurring, enough to give homesteaders time to recover, enough to matter. Some families left anyway, the weight of the struggle too much, the hope too thin, but others stayed, and slowly, painfully, they built something lasting, not an empire, not the grand vision that had drawn people west, but a community, people who helped each other, who stood together when threats emerged, who remembered what it meant to be human in a world that often seemed designed to strip humanity away. The Crane homestead survived. The debt was eventually worked down through years of careful management, crop rotation that Nashoba had learned from his people, and the simple passage of time. Garrett lived another 12 years, long enough to see the land truly recover, long enough to walk his daughter down an aisle she'd chosen to walk, long enough to hold a grandchild whose middle name was Sterling in his honor. Rosalind and Nashoba never married in the traditional sense. No ceremony, no papers, no formal binding. They simply stayed, chose each other, day after day, year after year, building a life that honored both their traditions and neither, creating something new from the pieces of two worlds that had collided so violently. They raised children who belonged to both worlds and neither, who learned to track game in the desert and plant crops in season, who spoke English and Spanish and enough Apache to honor their heritage, who understood that survival meant adaptation, meant taking the best from multiple sources and discarding the worst, meant being flexible enough to bend without breaking. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Rosalind would stand on the porch, the same porch where her father had once sat broken and defeated, and look at the land that had almost killed them all, the land they'd fought for, the land they'd kept through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. It would never be easy. The territory was harsh and unforgiving. Droughts would come again, struggles would continue, but they would face them together. Not bound by debt or obligation or desperate bargains, but by choice, by partnership, by the simple, powerful decision to stand with each other, whatever came. And in the end, that was the only honor that truly mattered, not the kind demanded by tradition or enforced by obligation, but the kind freely given, freely chosen, freely lived, the kind that said, "I see you, I value you, I choose you," every single day, That was the debt that bound no one and freed everyone. The wind quiets, the dust settles. In the desert, some debts are paid in gold, and others in courage. If you've walked this far with us, partner, tip your hat and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing this Western ride reach every corner of the world. And before you ride off, check out these other cool Western stories waiting on the trail. Each one's got a tale of grit, honor, and the kind of justice only the frontier can deliver. Until next time, keep your aim steady and your heart true.